Yeah, my name's Rob or Zeke. Some of you might know me in the community. I came into the type world about 9 years ago in 2013, and I started out in MBTI. And I immediately went into researcher mode. That's kind of my native mode, and did a lot of writing, made a lot of charts. Some of the charts that you guys see today are even from me. A lot of the compatibility charts come from me originally. And then my purview quickly changed into socionics about 2014 or 15. So I did a lot of work in socionics and questioning people and gathering a bunch of data. And then I found what's called psychosophia, or in English we would say psychosophy, but it's trademarked, so I don't like to use that. Another term for it would be psyche yoga. But my interest quickly shifted into that, which turned into researching and creating attitudinal psyche, which is what you guys see today. So those are my beginnings in the typology world.
Thank you for the second introduction. um, so yeah, so you've been into kind of just personality type in general for a while, right? So I know in PM you told me that in socionics you identify as what, an SEE, I
Yeah,
think.
I'm an SEE. I think they call it Napoleon. That's the short version of it. But um, yeah, sensory extroverted, sensory ethical extroverted, or ESF little p
The
would
little
be,
p, yeah,
yeah.
which is kind of similar to an MBTI ESFP, at least in terms of the valued functions and all
Yeah,
that.
some people might try to say no, it's more like ENFJ or ENTJ, but yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, socionic can get a little weird in terms of how they define things, how Briggs define things, how Young's define things. And I actually have some interesting questions about that a little later on that I think would be cool to talk about. So, what was the thing that launched you into wanting to start, your own system as opposed to maybe just kind of like refining something that we've seen? We have 100 versions of MBTI these days, but not many people start their own personality systems.
Yeah, so basically finding Psyche Yoga, which was originally written by Alexander Afanasyev, that has the core theory of AP within it. And it also shares its core theory with some other things. Like some of you might know attachment styles, which is like if you're fearful avoidant or whatever. Uh, I can't remember what the anxious, preoccupied, or secure. That has the same model, which is I refer to it as kind of the golden equation. So it's positive and negative on two axes. So you've got positive, negative, and it creates four different categories. And that's actually used for a lot of different personality systems. So in attitudinal psyche, what I did is I used that for attitude in general, an attitude among the four main modes of life, which is actually how Afanasyev describes it. So I do take that from him directly. However, focusing strictly on attitude is unique to my system, and his system was more about he calls them psychic elements, and it actually he brings more of like Enneagram into it and more behaviorisms on top of it. So it's a little bit different, but that's kind of where I started. And then once I started doing the research in AP, it was just like patterns left and right that I was seeing, and I had to write about it. So that's what really triggered me back in 2015 when I found this. I just started asking people questions about I actually have the questionnaire that a lot of people take still. I call it the APQ AI, but it's this 8 question survey that I ask people and have for years. And then I started looking at the answers I would get from that survey, and there was ridiculous patterns. And they weren't with MBTI, it wasn't with Enneagram, it wasn't with anything that I previously knew. So I'm like, there's something else happening here. And it was attitude. It was seeing people's attitude and how they relate in this specific way.
Right. Can you briefly maybe define for me what an attitude is? Like, how does that
Yeah.
differ, say, from
So,
like an MBTI letter?
yeah, so I go by, oh, say that again. What was the last
Like, how
part?
would that differ maybe from like an MBTI letter, for example, or maybe
Right.
even like
So
a cognitive function?
an attitude is a positive or a negative disposition towards an object. And the object in AP sense, how it's different from MBTI is the way that they're defined. So logic, emotions, physics, or foundation, since it's an F, and volition, it's kind of they're different than MBTI. Like some people might try to equate them. They might say, well, F is the same as sensing,
Right.
but it's really not because it's your attitude towards that thing. So you can actually be bad at introverted sensing, but you can still have a positive self view towards the physical realm. So somebody could be like, yeah, no, I know how to spend my money. I know what I like. I know my comforts. But they could be like an ENFJ or something. So that differentiates an AP type from an MBTI type. And it ends up looking really strange when you have some mixes that you wouldn't expect, like an ESTP that has one E, or confident emotions is how I
Right.
would call it. That's somebody who's self-positive in emotions. It looks strange, but it gives more dimension to the MBTI types, which is interesting.
Yeah, that definitely is interesting. It's kind of like how you can map enneagrams or Jungian archetypes over MBTI to get these weird combinations of, traits and characteristics that aren't so normal. So that is interesting that it is. I guess I get the name now, the attitudinal psyche, because I always wondered, where that came from. Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
the
like
the whole like slotting system. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but the slotting
no, it's
system
okay.
you say kind of was like adapted from that other Russian system you were talking about. Because when I did the video on that, I was like, whoa, this is a lot more complex than just four letters in a row. Like,
Yeah, yeah, and I am a sensor in MBTI, so a lot of people, that's like the first criticism I get is this is too like easy and basic, but really there is a lot of underlying theory within it, and I love to go through all that. But um, so the slotting system does come from Afanasyev, and he used the golden equation, which is used in many other systems before him. So he kind of borrowed that, and then I'm borrowing that from him. But the
most
slotting
psychologies like
system.
that.
Yes. So the slotting system is, again, it's the positive negative. So if you were to draw it out, you would do it like just a square, like a window with
Right.
four squares. You would put positive and negative up here, positive, negative on the other axis, and then you get positive, 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 negative, 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 positive.
Right.
And those stand for the self and others. So in AP, it's about your self attitude. So it's literally your attitude towards how you handle all four of those elements, or four of those aspects, as we call them. And then the second one is your opinion of how other people handle that aspect, because we do have those attitudes as well. So is it positive or negative? And some people even have like an ambivalent attitude, which usually comes from the combination of both
The
coming
positive and
together.
negative, yeah.
Right. So it can be ambivalence. And what we would call that in AP is the results orientations. So the first and the fourth attitudes, they have that positive and negative. So the first attitude is self positive and others negative.
Right.
Which, if you think about that, that's somebody who's really going to rely on their own view of that particular aspect. If you have it the opposite way, self negative and others positive, it's somebody who will just take the information from outside world and run with that and say, yes, that's correct. Okay. And then they move on because they're not self interested, it's self negative. So that's how you get the fourth unbothered or unconcerned attitude. But the point is, those two tend to be more results oriented because it's the energy goes in one direction. So it's not, it doesn't match. It's not like you have a positive towards your own aspects and you have a positive attitude towards others. Where if you were that, you're going to think about the information that exchanges hands between both people, which would make it more process oriented. You're constantly discussing it, thinking
Right.
about it, changing it. Where with the first and the fourth attitudes, you don't do that. So that's why they're more results oriented. And that's actually the biggest tell for somebody's type. Once you get a little bit closer to them and you talk to them more, is what are they processing and what are they more concerned about the results?
Right. When I was, if I remember correctly, when I talked about the fourth letter in my video, I think I described it as something that maybe you'd want to like outsource. Does that sound right? Like
Yeah.
maybe you'd rather have somebody who you know is competent in that thing help you out with it.
Yeah, once you become aware of it. Now, some people don't even want that. Some people, there's different subtypes of the fourth, and that's a whole nother thing we could get into. But um, yeah, sometimes people, once they become aware of it, they will outsource it or ask other people, what should I do? What's the quickest way I can get this done, basically, because it's flippant. So that's another adjective I like to use is flippancy for the fourth and the first aspect. So it's kind of like, how do you get this done? How do you get it out of your mind so you don't have to think about it for too long? What's the quickest, most efficient way to just get through it? So it looks different depending on the aspects. Like, for instance, a 4L might be interested in logic, but they're trying to get an answer so that they can move forward with whatever else they're working with. And the same goes for like a 4V, so unbothered or unconcerned volition. They may actually, have a project or something, but they want a specific role that they know that they have to take and that the decision is quick and easy to make so that they can move forward. They don't want to endlessly talk about the decisions they can make. They don't want to
Right.
yeah, it doesn't have to be a continuous process to where they're wasting too much time on it because that's another thing. The fourth doesn't want to waste too much time.
Right, because they just kind of want to get it out of sight, out of mind.
Yes. Yep.
So, volition is actually something that I wanted to touch on because I think, in my opinion, that's one of the most interesting if you're comparing to someone like me who does a lot of work with MBTI and stuff, because MBTI doesn't have any sort of measure of anything like volition. Now,
Nope.
Briggs talked about volition as an aspect in her book Gifts Differing when she talked about the introverted intuitives specifically, but a lot of people think maybe she overhyped them a little bit because she wasn't one herself and she saw them as maybe being these determined people. Um, but other people and like Jung never attributed volition to introverted intuition as a function. So it's something that I highly relate to. I actually type when I take your test and look at the types, I type as a V first type myself. So how do you think maybe volition fits into the personality code compared to these other traits? It is kind of the unique one, like the redheaded stepchild, in my opinion.
Yeah, so volition, there's a way that I explain it that's called encapsulation. And the best way I can say it is volition is the highest order. So if you were to rank them, or if you were to put them on like a hierarchy, your base level, that's like what you can see, touch, feel, look at, that's physics. So it's literally matter. Just think of like atoms. That's
Right.
physics. Anything you can touch, see, smell, taste, spend, even like money, the physical form of money, and physical worth or physical value. So we can get a little bit conceptual, but physics is still that base foundation. Then we go up to logic, and we think of logic as like comparing two things. So it's when you look at the physical realm, the matter that's within it, and then we go up a level and we start comparing them and creating and contrasting and looking at all these ways that different things are different and how they are the same and have patterns. So that would be the second step. The third step is emotions. That's when we start to have personal feelings, thoughts, um, values, judgments about logic and physics. Now, we can also have emotional judgments about volition, but you don't have to have volition to create an emotional judgment. You do have to have things and logic. You have to understand how things work, or at least how you believe things work, to have that emotional thing. So emotions come above logic. And then finally, we have volition, which is like the top of the highest order of the hierarchy, and it's about all those advanced human belief systems and thoughts like peace and war and love and like
Right.
things that are beyond like decision making, responsibilities, all the things that takes a little bit of complexity and abstraction to really understand. And that's kind of where it has a little bit of a similarity to introverted intuition or even extroverted intuition, but it still is its own separate category because it's anything that is a decision or requires an active thought of where you are going to change your timeline to a different thing. So it's decisions. It's pure decision making, and it's really activation energy is the best way I can. It's like when you first wake up in the morning, what do you decide that you're going to do? That's volition. It's
Okay.
something that you really can't explain. It's kind of the human element that brings everything together.
Right. So it's kind of like a drive towards the more like conceptual aspects of human needs. Because the way that you
Yeah.
described that almost like to me came off as almost kind of like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs type of things, where, as you go up it, then you start to approach things that are more towards self actualization, I should say, in some
Yeah.
sense.
Yes, and it has an effect on the types as well. So if you were to follow that hierarchy from bottom to top within a type structure, you can see why a type looks the way that it does. So, for instance, a VELF, um, there's I call them a couple different things, but if we were to look at that type, it's it's the actual hierarchy from top to bottom, and that's why that type often looks like gray because you can't quite see what they're about because they've got the physics last. They're not worrying about the physical realm. They've got logic in the third, so they're really skeptical about people's ideas or skeptical about their own ideas, whether they're right, how things work. And then they've got the emotion second, so they're emotionally open towards other people. They're flexible. They
Right.
are concerned about their own emotions and your emotions and how they go back and forth. And then they've got the volition first, so they really do what they want to do and they don't listen to others. But having the rest of that stack like that, it doesn't look like they're that way. So they come off, I like to call them gray because they always see the middle. They always see how things can change and how the middle's different, or at least that's how their attitude makes them out to be. They might
Right.
be an MBTI type that's very decisive, like an ENTJ. However, their attitude isn't going to make you see that until you study their words and what they're actually saying.
Right. And it's interesting that you bring up that type because between that one and then its kind of cousin, the VLEF, or the two that I typically test on, and being like an INTJ and MBTI, the possibility of being like an E over L type was very weird to me. It was like, oh, I wonder if maybe that is a possibility. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, so that's why I think it was kind of an interesting mirror there. So,
Yeah, it's very fascinating, especially, when I was first doing all the research, I was testing a lot of like ENTPs and ESTPs. I actually went into that group and was trying to find actual, ESTPs. And I did. I found a bunch of them, and a lot of them are 1E, which was very weird for me. I'm like, how could these like low FI people, barely any FE, have this 1E? And it was strange to me, but after I started to gather everybody else's results, it made sense that there really is no correlation. The correlations that are there are pretty weak. I mean, there are some,
yeah,
but yeah, it was really interesting. It showed me that really attitude and your cognition are totally different.
right. So cognition's kind of like your, I like to describe it as almost like your hardware. Like it's just kind of like your natural way of processing whatever. But it seems like the way that you're describing the attitude aspect is almost more like, I don't want to say like a fully conscious decision, but like how you're choosing to direct the direction of the hardware that you're giving.
Yeah, it's subconscious. So I would say like you know, your cognition is just entirely unconscious is what comes out. And I'd say your Enneagram probably falls in that category too, unconscious. You can make Enneagram more subconscious, but I would say your attitude is more subconscious and it can come into your conscious view as well, much easier than your cognition or your Enneagram type or your ego motivation.
Right. So I can't remember if you said earlier, but do you have any history in like psychology as a formal field, or was this kind of like a passion project type of thing?
No, I did like a minor. I started a minor in psychology, but I didn't finish it. I was too wrapped up in linguistics. That's actually my field, linguistics. So no, I don't have any like formal training in psychology or anything like that. It's all just my own research and interest.
Nothing. Neither did Briggs. So she was a social sciences major or a political science. Sorry, I think something along those lines.
Yeah,
It
that
wasn't
would,
psych.
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
so it is interesting to see how that works. Have you ever considered maybe like working with somebody who has formal psychometrics training to like get like hiring a PhD or something to work with you and formalize the system?
Yeah, I have informally. I've worked with people that have, much more. of an education than I do and an academic history, but yeah, I have thought of it, and I'm sure in the future there will be, something that I'll do or people that I'll work with to try to get. The main thing I want to do is the research, like giving my research or sharing it with somebody and getting like somebody who's better at understanding it and extrapolating information from it than myself. So that's
Yeah,
probably where I'll go down in the future, just to validate what I think I've already seen in the patterns that I've recognized over the years.
right. Another thing that's kind of interesting about your system with the letters, well, for one, they're not oppositional to each other like you would find in most systems. I think that was the thing that immediately stood out to me is that you could have them in any order, which leads to the. I'm sorry, how many total types is it?
24.
The 24, right? 24. So it leads to the 24 types, and I think that is what is really interesting as compared to maybe MBTI, where you already have 16, which is kind of a lot. Like, you don't think of it as a lot with people, but in reality, 16 is a decent amount of types. And then you get to 24, and you're like, wow, so there's even more that could be layered upon these types. So I think that the first thing a lot of like a psych major might ask you in this question was, do you think that these categories of the four letters are discrete enough that they don't overlap very much in qualities? Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah, they are. They're very discreet. The only time they do run into issues and might get a little overlappy is like the what I would call the near identical types. So if you switch your first and second attitude, that type will look the most similar to you in attitude. And then there's another one, it's the cousin relation, which would be if you flip your third and your fourth aspects, they tend to look a little bit similar to you too, although more different than your near identical type. So for you, if you're a VLEF, it would be LVEF would be your near identical, and that will look the most similar to you in practice.
Okay.
So that's the only issue I would come up against if we were going to talk about overlap. Just because the way that the first and the second attitude do work together, they can just kind of look the same
Right.
sometimes.
It's kind of like looking at an INTP and an ENTP in MBTI. It's like you have all the same functions. There's just a slight switch in the order of them.
Right. But the biggest giveaway and something for people, especially if they're trying to type themselves, what you talk about the most is probably your second aspect because when we think of it, it's our first aspect is kind of like our ego. It's like what we believe we should be good at and what we believe we should understand, we should be better than others at, we should have this gift within ourselves. That's the first attitude. Where the second one is supportive of that. So the second one is like finding information in the world, talking about it with others, but it bolsters the first attitude. So if somebody is talking about something constantly, like if it's a 2F, if they're always talking about fashion, if they're always talking about who's wearing what and different things they've bought for their house and all this new stuff and they go on and they want to know your opinion about it, that's 2F. But then it's like, what is that contributing towards? Like, how is it making their ego feel secure? And that's where you get the first attitude. So if it's somebody that's kind of like making hardcore decisions about their lives and they're showing that through their materials and they're trying to share the materials with others to show their power, to show their volition, that's going to be a 1V2F. And that's going to look really different than somebody that's like 1E2F. They're going to be more pulling those items and the physical realm. It's going to be pulled more into their art and their emotional opinions about people and things. So that's kind of how these things all work together. It's kind of like a
Right.
floating system, you know what I mean? Or it
Yeah.
flows into one another.
I know when I was looking at the dynamics of the system, I was like, oh, there's a lot of like weird combinations here that you wouldn't really think about. And I spent days being like, oh, wow, I noticed that trait maybe in, my significant other or something along those lines. Where it's like that. I don't think MBTI would have revealed that specific style of, interaction or thinking.
Absolutely. Yeah, there is strange combinations. It's 24 types, so you do get some real whoppers after a while. It's
Yeah,
like,
right.
what is that? And yeah, some of those are strange. Like the weirdest type by far is EFLV, which I call the satirist, however you want to say it.
Right.
Um, they're strange. That's the only word I can use to describe them. They are freaking strange, and it's because they've got the 4V, which is kind of like whatever, I'll make a decision, it doesn't matter. I'm going to do it quickly. They've got the 3L, so they're very skeptical about logic, and it can make them kind of fighty or punchy against like theories or people who are insisting that they're correct.
Right.
But not really, because they've also got the 2F that wants to share the physical world. So they're always talking about things that they're doing and new diets, new things that they've cooked, new things that they've bought. So if you think of the 2F, even with the 4V, that already gets weird because 4V is wanting to make quick decisions, but you've got the 2F that's wanting to share things in their reality. And then you've got 1E, which is highly opinionated about emotions and what they think about people, and they don't really care about your opinion unless it's like quick and to the point and they can
Right.
understand it. So you put all those together and you got somebody that is very strange, and it comes out, it almost makes them hide everything about themselves. And that's why I think they are the satirist or the satirist, because they pretend to be dumb, which you would think a 3L wouldn't be like that. They would want to be like, no, 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 I'm
Right.
not stupid. I'm insecure about that. I'm definitely, but they actually do. And they also pretend not to have feelings, even though they're a 1E. And
Right.
then they pretend that, all the physics around them is a joke. Everything is a joke and funny. And then 4V is kind of lax and like whatever. So it creates an interesting personality. And they're also very rare. It's hard for me to find them. So
Almost like a
something's
trickster
weird's going on
archetype.
there.
Someone like maybe like Loki type of character comes to mind when you talk about those descriptions.
Say that again?
I said something like the Loki type of character,
Yep, yep, yep. EFLV, absolutely.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So what type do like you identify as in your own system?
Yeah, so I'm an EVLF, so you'd call that the catalyst, that's what I've named it.
Right.
Um, yeah, 1E, 2V, 3L, 4F.
Okay.
So,
Interesting.
yeah.
So EV. Okay. So it takes my brain a second to process all these. So
Yeah.
that's an emotion lead, right? Yeah, EV.
Yeah, so,
Yes. Okay.
everything flows back into my emotional opinions, my emotions, how I feel about others, how I feel about pretty much anything, all relationships. And even it can even be emotional aesthetics too. Like aesthetics doesn't have to fall under physics. It's in how the person perceives it. So
Right.
if it's something emotional, then it would be more 1E rather than 1F.
Right. Okay.
And and just to throw this out there, there's also dichotomies with the aspects, and that's another thing that kind of gives a good idea of how they work. I should have said this earlier, but there's three different dichotomies. There's the first one is the most obvious one, and it's how V and F are different from L and E. So V and F are your visceral aspects. It's what you see when you look at somebody. It's their decisions and their physicality. And then logic and emotion are the communicative aspects. So it's more of how we communicate with one another. You have to almost speak about it to really learn how it operates. Although emotions can be personal, it is something that's more communicated in between people. So that's one dichotomy. Another one would be like volition and emotions, how they're related, and then how they're different from logic and physics. And this is more like spiritual versus real. So volition and emotions is the higher order. Again, if we think of VELF, the V and E are on the top. It's more spiritual, abstract, things that we can't see. Logic and physics is more detail oriented. It's the actual details and how they relate with one another. And then the third dichotomy is how V and L relate compared to F and E. So V and L are more your yang, kind of, we would say traditionally masculine, I guess,
Right.
but it's putting out the energy. It's calculation. So to make a decision, which is volition, and to think about how things correlate and decide, like the logic about it, that's calculating, which is traditionally more yang. And then emotions and physics, it's caretaking, it's how your body feels, sensations, your emotions towards other people. That's more yin or more receiving energy, or thinking about how things feel and affect you
Yeah.
personally. So those are the three dichotomies, and that's how you can really tell apart the aspects, especially when you're typing other people.
So I imagine you get some even like unique interactions when you have some of those dichotomies at like the first and the fourth slot, for example, where, if they have something shared between each other, but also they're on opposite ends, you get these weird.
Yeah, and you're getting into what's called the sextas. So those are the six groupings of types based on results and process shared between the aspects.
Okay, so that's how you do your grouping. Okay.
Yes. So um, for you, it would be VLEF, so that would be Pente, and that would be all types with V and F in the first and fourth slots. And you flip it backwards too. So
Right,
it's
with the F's and the
FLEV,
V's. Yeah.
FELV, VELF, and VLEF.
A lot of
And
types.
then yeah, and those are the pentes, and they share characteristics too. So I've found that pentes tend to be more politically interested in things. They tend to monitor social trends, even if they're not like a social dominant in Enneagram, they still have a flippant opinion about social trends. And they tend to be more talkative about how the world works and how reality works because they have emotions and logic in the process positions. All of the types do in Pente, which again, we just said, those are the communication aspects. So that's where this comes into play. I'm glad you got at that because you can look at those dichotomies and you can place them over all the sextas and you can see why each sexta is the way that they are and how they relate to one another.
Right, and that makes more sense now that you explain it, why we have these kind of flipped types in the same sexta. It's very similar to the idea of like Socionics quadras, where it's like, yeah, even if they're completely upside down types, they share values in some sense, or they share
Yeah,
some same interaction style when it comes to their.
absolutely. And in AP it's attitude, but yeah,
Yeah.
same idea, same theoretical basis, and it all goes back to math.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what was the biggest like roadblock for you when it came to developing this? Was there any point like during the creation process where you're like, oh, I don't know if this is like something that I can make work or figure out?
Well, I am a 3L, so I do have issues with logic, at times, and I do feel a little skeptical about things, and I do want things to be perfect when it comes to the logic, so that
Right.
can kind of get me down if I don't see it. Um, but it usually, as a 3L, and all 3Ls can probably relate to this, when things are wrong like that, if it's too anxiety inducing, then I will ignore it for a couple days. But it never stays that way. It always comes back into my view. And I think with AP, a lot of it was just sometimes not seeing any patterns and wondering, is this even real? Like what's going on here? And a lot of it is just reminding myself, especially as a 3L, you got to keep looking, you got to keep gathering. You can't just give up because one thing doesn't line up. And that's really what pushed me to keep going through it. And also funny because I'm using my own system that I'm doubting about to help myself.
Right. I thought it was interesting when you told me that you in socionics were like an SCE or in Briggs like an ESFP, and it was like that's like one of the last types I would think of as being like developing a personality theory system, especially one as complex and nuanced as this. But then when you describe it in terms of like your approach through the type within your system, it makes more sense, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And again, there's these combinations between socionics and AP have been strange to say the least, but it's made it make more sense for people that are like constantly mistyping, and there's other reasons that people mistype or that are always confused about their type. Sometimes it is just your attitude is different or what you value is different. And it can also relate to Enneagram, which is a another interesting thing I can get into. Um, is just the similarities I've seen with Enneagram and AP. Um, but yeah, the combinations have definitely been surprising. Even just off the top of my head, some of them, um, like a lot of EIEs, or some of you might consider that ENFJ, a lot of them are 4E. So you think a socionics type with strong extroverted feeling or extroverted ethics would know what they feel, but a lot of them don't. They doubt what they feel, or they don't care what they feel. They're more interested in how you feel.
They kind of
So
outsource it, yeah.
yeah, it's been strange.
Because that is a lot of the times, like if you think of FE as a function in MBTI, usually there's two sides of a spectrum I look at where you have like the kind of almost matriarchal extroverted feeling that's like taking care of the emotional sphere, and then you have like almost the subservient caretaking FE, which is just like, yeah, whatever, I'll do whatever, like let's make it work. And I
Yeah.
can see how that might relate to like first and fourth emotion in some sense.
Yep. Yep. And also, some even insecure emotions. There's people that have insecure emotions that are high valuing FE types.
So I had two questions.
Yeah.
Let's start with the first one. So, unlike many other systems, do you think that attitude can change over the lifespan? Like, could your type change in your system?
No, I don't think your type changes. From everybody that I've interviewed and all my clients that I have never found somebody that has said, I mean, people have wondered, but once we get down into it, their attitude really has not changed ever since their first memory, even. So I don't have any evidence so far that your type can change. I haven't had anybody in my system that their type changes. However, I do have a subtype system, and I do think your subtype can change. So there's ways that you deal with your attitude that can change, the ways that you let your attitude be seen that can change, but not your actual attitude. It seems to remain pretty consistent in the way that the system defines it anyway.
Right. That's kind of how I would describe the idea of like subtypes in MBTI, where I would say like maybe the subtype and what you're focusing on can shift throughout the lifespan, but in general you're going to have the same, function, preference, order, that sort of thing. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, even people, they'll tell me about memories when they were younger. And they pretty much always start out knowing their confident aspect and what they have to rely on. And I think it relates to the ego again. And that's where the Enneagram comes out, because the Enneagram is all about the ego defense, the defense strategy that you develop, or it was already inborn, I don't know, but that's what comes out and makes you feel like you can, move freely and safely in the world. And I think that's your first attitude, is where that the first bond happens between ego and this is the thing that I relate to in the world.
Right. So do you find that the first function in terms of ego is often the thing that like either you feel like maybe you're good at, I don't know if good's the right word, but it's the thing that you feel like you can do almost without question. Like
Yeah.
it's just, oh, it's who I am. Because that's often how I feel about like volition, for example. Well, for me, I've never once had the thought, can I do this? It's always, how will I do this? Like, what's the goal? What's the way to get about doing this? And that's why I related strongly with the volition high types, because it was just like, all right, let's do it, instead of questioning the ability to do it. Okay, so that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, your Enneagram will come out in your first attitude. It's not as obvious though as your third. Your third attitude is where the Enneagram defense strategy is constantly coming out, because your third attitude is often where you believe you can be attacked by other people and made embarrassed or looked, whatever your Enneagram core fear is will
Right.
come out in that third aspect. So for me, I'm a seven. So as a seven, sevens fear being inferiorized, being trapped, being emotionally drugged through the mud. So that will come out through logic. And I don't like to be wrong. I don't like to look stupid. I
Right.
don't like other people to prove that I'm doing something wrong and they're doing something right. So you'll see that. And that was another thing. I was starting to get clients and doing the whole business thing. And I was like, what is happening with people? Why when we talk about the third aspect, they like are having these weird patterns that I've never seen. And then I was seeing it in the first attitude as well, but the first attitude, it was deeper. It was harder to get people to react.
Right.
And then a couple years ago, I realized this is Enneagram. Like, this has to be Enneagram because people are talking about all these motivating factors when it comes to that. And it was. I had started researching Enneagram, and sure enough, that's what I was seeing. And I realized, oh, Enneagram's real.
Right. The core motivations, I think, are such a huge aspect to personality that goes beyond things like MBTI, where it again is that hardware. I like Enneagram a little bit. I'm a really big fan of the Jungian 12 archetypes because I think they encompass motivations as well. So it's like kind of interesting that now you're saying we could have an MBTI type, an Enneagram type, and an attitudinal psyche type, and all three of them together form this kind of complete picture because they're not really overlapping in terms of what it is that they're measuring about the personality. Is that right?
Yeah, it's true. And I think Enneagram, you can even break that down into what drives you, which would be the instincts, and then the motivations. So, it does seem like kind of pillars that are happening together, and that's what creates the person. And there's other factors. There's human sexuality and all sorts of weird stuff in between that I'm sure comes with it. But those do seem like the main things that are happening, those 4 or 5 different systems.
Right. Wow. Okay. I'm trying to think if I've got any other big question. I do see a question in chat. Do you want to answer that? Can you see the Twitch
Yeah.
chat right now? If
Yeah.
not, I can read it to you. It's from Anomalous Lore. Curious if you saw any correlations between developing your system and language theories.
Evolution of expression and links to prominent use of the communicative attitudes in a type. Well, yeah, there's a whole lot there that I could unpack. So language usage, it has to do with length. So if somebody is talking at length about something, it's usually a process attitude. And then if they're kind of short, quick, to the point, if they're more declarative in their statements, it's going to be results attitudes. That's a general pattern. It
So
doesn't
first
always
and
have to
fours
be.
results, right? Just to,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. It's a general pattern. It doesn't have to always be that way, but I'd say 80% of the time, that's how people are in behavior in relation to their type, because sometimes people behave strangely for different reasons and it has nothing to do with attitude. So you can't always go by behavior, and language can be a reflection of how somebody intends to behave. So it's an interesting way to measure, but um, yeah, when it comes to linguistics or language, and then there's other things that I've found too. There's little quirks here and there with, especially with the fourth, the unconcerned, unbothered aspect. The way that people talk about it in specific words that people will use in English anyway. And I'm not sure if they do it in other languages, but I would imagine so. There's been patterns. There's just a lot of patterns that I've seen with language usage. Hopefully, I answered that correctly.
Right. So is there any like really strong correlations you find between, say, like MBTI types and certain types in your systems, or do you find that there's a general like spread for the most part?
Yeah, there's a general spread. I don't think there's hardly any correlations. There's maybe a couple. Um, Trying to think offhand. Again, a weird one was the ENTP, ESTP, and 1E. That's
Yeah.
kind of a weird anomaly.
I might, for example, expect EJs to be high in volition. Like,
No, they're not.
really? Okay.
Yeah. No, they're usually a lot of them are 3V. Yeah, like a lot of ESTJs are 3V, and they're actually a lot of them are 1F, weirdly enough. There's a lot of FLVE ESTJs. There are some 1Vs, I mean, but it's pretty
Right.
evenly spread. There's even 4VEJs. Um,
And you'd expect kind of an even spread with 24 types because there's a lot of different possible results
yeah,
there.
yeah, and yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I just never found anything significant. That's why I don't have a good memory about it, because it just, when looking at the data, it just wasn't there. And even people that self-report, which I know that's not a good way, but I've probably had about 200,000 people take
Wow.
tests over the
Huge data
years.
pool.
Yeah, it's been 6 years,
I have at
so
least
a lot of
100 of
people.
those. No.
It's been a lot. So even self-reporting, there is no correlation, which you would think with self-reporting there would be because people have these preconceived ideas about how types correlate. But no, there really has not been much of a correlation.
Right.
People are trying to. I've noticed recently, now that people are getting into my system more and it's all over like personality database, people are trying to equate it and they're having like strange ideas about the system, but that's normal for any typology system. It's always going to be misconstrued sometimes.
Right. Like I was saying with the V first and the EJs. I think if I ever see people talking about EJs, they're like, oh, look how decisive they are. Look at all these things they do. You know, it's like, oh, maybe that's not exactly what was intended with being a V first in the system.
Yeah, they could even be 4V if they're flipping about, their decision making, or if they're quick, and also if they're what's the word? If they like routine. Like a lot of 4Vs love routine because it's quick to the point, they know what they have to do and they move forward. So,
Right. It when you were describing the 4V much earlier in the call, it almost spawned to mind something like an ISTJ in my mind, where we expect
yeah.
them to be very accomplished and still do lots of things, but it's maybe not through drive, but more so through like honing their routines and honing their ability to get things done efficiently.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
I know for me, when I describe like my work ethics, it's usually something along the lines of it's either like 0% of or 150%. I have a very weird relationship with like just doing things consistently. It's more so just like, all right, I got to do it right
Yeah.
now. Um,
Yeah, that's results volition for sure. I would call that typical 1V attitude.
okay, interesting. Wow, I've learned so much today. Um,
Yeah.
trying to say, if anyone has questions, now's a great time to ask because we're coming up on like the 45-minute, getting close to the hour mark now. How long have we been going? 50 minutes. Okay, so we'll go another 10, 15 minutes. I don't want to take your whole day. But if anyone has questions, now is the perfect time to ask, and we can run through those real quick. So, what has been, I don't know, like the most enjoyable aspect of all this for you? Like, do you enjoy working with the people? Like, I think you do some coaching too, like a little bit, or things along those
Yeah,
lines,
I
or?
do. Yeah, I do typing sessions. I love the typing sessions because it gets into, again, it gets both into Enneagram and AP, and Enneagram is kind of like my other love of
Really?
the systems. It wasn't before. I never really liked Enneagram until, again, these patterns emerged, and I was like, oh
It's
my
been growing
God.
on me too, I have to admit. 2 years ago, I would have been like, oh, I don't like Enneagram.
Yeah, it's because the common conception of Enneagram is way different than what it actually is. And I didn't know that until I started digging deep into it. And I'm like, whoa, this is way different than how I thought it was. So that's been lately, yeah, I love just talking to people and learning more about, um, their motivations and behaviors and strategies and all that. So lately, that's been the most fun part. But I just love theorizing and then seeing if it's true. I think that's the most interesting part to me
Okay.
is, yeah, just because I can theorize like crazy. I can come up with all sorts of weird, bizarre new ideas and then be like, okay, does this actually work or not? Because I do want to know if it works. I'm not an extroverted intuition valuer. I don't want to just theorize to theorize. I want to
Right.
know that it has a basis in reality.
And that's what I was thinking as you were saying that. It was like, I think people underestimate the SE type's ability to kind of want to play with reality. For them, it's kind of like a playground.
Yeah,
Um,
well, it's about power,
yeah.
and I'm not saying I care about power, but it is about the power between people and noticing how we affect one another as human beings. I mean, that is within the extroverted sensing purview, at least in the socionic sense. I know in MBTI it's a little different. Um,
Socionics describes a kind of force to SE, if I remember
yeah,
correctly.
yeah, it's force, and what they mean by that is like the force between two things. Like, how does this A thing A affect thing B, affects thing C? So it works like extroverted intuition. They're just doing it about ideas and abstract things, where extroverted sensing, it's what we can actually see and people that affect one another, especially if you have FI in there as well. That makes it even more so about people.
Right. So, are you comfortable sharing what your Enneagram is? Or do you
Yeah,
know?
I'm a 7. Yeah, I'm a 7. And then tri-type, I'd be a 748. And my instinctual drives would be sexual first, and then social second, and self-pres last. So you have like a stacking. I don't know if everybody knows that, but
Right.
um,
Enneagram's
yeah,
complex. There's wing theory and then tri-types. And it's like, all right, what are we doing here? It's like,
yeah, the Enneagram gets crazy. But I think the main thing about Enneagram is what's your driving force, and then your main type. So I would be a sexual 7.
okay, cool. Wow. I don't know if I know a ton of sevens. I think most of the people who come into my Discord and stuff are like fives or fours because a lot of the introverted types who also have intuition tend to fall into the 5 and 4 category, I find.
Yep, a lot of sixes too.
Sixes, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of sixes that think they're fives and fours as well. Not to throw any shade, but
That's true. That's true. And it's really interesting when you meet like an Enneagram. It's just like with your system, when you meet someone who's not like traditional to that type within their Enneagram. I worked with a 9 INFP the other day in a coaching session. It was like a whole different experience than working with the 4 INFPs. It's like, whoa, this is a
yeah.
entirely different person.
Yeah, yeah, and I get them as well. And now, if we're going to talk about correlations, Enneagram has a much stronger correlation with the AP types than any other system
Does it? Okay.
that I've found. Yeah. So, if we talk about like your type, for instance, VLEF, a VLEF 5 or a 6, they're going to be totally different, and even a VLEF 1 will be completely different from them. So I have the same attitudes, but the way that they kind of navigate the world is totally different.
What's motivating those attitudes, essentially?
Yes, yes, because a 1 is, wants to be right, morally correct, and doesn't ever want to feel that they're inherently wrong in a guttural sense. Like, I don't want to feel wrong. So you combine that with VLEF, and that's somebody who has a really strong moral compass, and their 3E is going to be much more um, self-confident than we would think of a typical 3E. However, once you dig in, you will see that it is insecure. It looks different than a VLEF 5, who's going to be more of an information gatherer than a 1, because the 5 doesn't want to feel like they're ignorant. It's less about being wrong, and it's more about, I need that information. So they'll talk to you more than a VLEF 1 will.
When it comes to the sexes, do you find that there tends to be any type of like communication preferences? Like, do people prefer to communicate within their preference, or is there like relationships to other sexes that they enjoy but don't enjoy? You know what I mean?
Yeah, usually people prefer communicating with their own sexta, although some people will gravitate to one other sexta, and usually it's not the one that's opposite of them because they tend to not get along very well at first.
Right.
People can grow on one another, and that's usually what happens when people are in opposing sextas. So for you as a pente, the opposing sexta to that would be DO, which would be uh, EVFL, EFVL, LFVE, and
Okay.
LVFE.
So E first, L last, or L
Yeah.
first, E last. Okay.
Yes, so they tend to clash a lot, especially in politics. I think a lot of the political issues that you see facing our world is driven by Pentes and Dios that either are not getting along or trying to get along.
Right.
Um, yeah, and the same can be said for the other clashing sextas, 1 and 4 and 3 and 6. I'll just name them by number instead of what they're
Yeah.
actually called. But yeah, they differentiate in separate things. So it's politics for your clashing sexta, but for Enna and Tessera, it's more about idealism and ways that they believe they should live their lives. And then for Tria versus Exi, which is two other conflicting, it's more about like um, where they should go in life, their goals, their work, how they evolve. They disagree about that. So yeah, it does come down to particulars when we look at people that relate in different sexes, I guess.
Interesting. All right. Well, I think we've been going almost an hour now. So, is there any topic that you wanted to discuss that you feel like we didn't get to?
No, I mean, I could talk forever, but yeah, I think that was a good basis of how it all works together.
Great. So I'm not seeing any more questions. I'm gonna leave it up for about 2 more minutes, and we'll see if anybody asks any final questions before we go ahead and start to close. But I don't want the stream to be like 2 hours. An hour and a half, 2 hours.
No worries.
But I really enjoy the attitudinal psyche system. You know, if you're someone who's watching this, as I mentioned, I'll probably put it on the YouTube channel, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Go check out the test. Go check out the system. Figure it out. And for my recommendation, I don't know if you would agree with this, but for me, sometimes the test, because I notice you change it every now and then.
All the time.
Some iterations tend to get me a little more accurate than others, so maybe look through the types and see if there's anything you also relate to. It's kind of like with MBTI. You're not always just going to find the test to be the perfect
Yeah.
indicator of the thing, as much as
Tests
we wish
don't
it was that
work.
easy.
I'll
Maybe
just say
even
it.
maybe even get a
Don't really
typing
work.
session with him so you can figure out your type with his system. But I think that this was a really good conversation. I really enjoy your system. I really hope it works in the future, and maybe someday down the line, we can have another stream like this. I'd be happy to have you on again.
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing anybody ask anything, so let's go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks everyone for watching. Don't forget to go check out. Can they find you other than the website? Do you have like a YouTube or anything that you want to
Yeah, same
plug?
thing. Same thing. You just type in attitudinal psyche and it'll take you there.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you so much. Have a good one, everyone.